Nicolette Nyman is running for U.S. Congress from the 2nd District of California.
My name is Sadie Bolze. I'm with the American Grass-Fed Association, and I get the privilege to talk to people across the United States from different realms of different backgrounds, I should say. And today we are getting the opportunity to talk to Nicolette Nyman out of Northern California, and she is throwing her hat in the ring on the political side and running for a congressional seat. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over. And could you give us a little bit of your background and why you're running?
Yes, I would love to, and thank you for inviting me. So I live in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco, and we actually are on a wonderful spot for ranching. My husband started this ranch. He's originally from Minnesota, and so he didn't grow up on a farm. He grew up, in fact, with his family owned a small grocery store. It was called Niman Groceries, and he had already started this ranch, and he actually first started raising pigs, and then he moved into raising cattle, and then he stopped raising pigs entirely, mostly because it was realized that this was not a very good environment for pigs, but because you basically have to bring in all the feed. But it's a perfect place to raise grazing animals. And so we're in a kind of a windswept place. It's kind of cool year round, not very hot and not cold. It's kind of what they call a Mediterranean climate. And in fact, it is a Mediterranean climate because it has this unusual weather pattern as well as far as the rain. It rains during the winter, and that's pretty much it. So we get rain starting in kind of late October often. Sometimes Halloween is our first big rain. And then they go to middle, late April. Right around now, they're starting to stop. So, and that's it. And then the rest of the time, it doesn't rain pretty much. That's why people like to have outdoor weddings in this part of California, because you can do that. You don't have to worry too much about the likelihood of rain. Anyway, when Bill and I got married 23 years ago, I moved out here and I was living in New York at the time, and I was a lawyer. I had been practicing law for 10 years, and the last two jobs I had had were for environmental nonprofit organizations. And they were, one was called National Wildlife Federation, and the other one was Waterkeeper Alliance. And in the second job in particular, that was when I was working in New York. I was working for Bobby Kennedy Jr., and we were focusing on water quality issues, but very specifically on things that were being caused, problems that were being caused by large industrial operations. So it turned out that a lot of the people we worked for were farmers and ranchers. We were working in a lot of rural communities, and for many of the people we worked with were multi-generational farmers or ranchers, and they had homes and farms and ranches that they really cared about, and large concentrated kind of industrial style operations were coming in and setting up shop right next to where they were living and where their families had been for generations. So it was actually sort of the beginning of my work and my connection to agriculture and to rural people and rural communities. And to the outside eye, it might sort of look like it was against agriculture, but it really was pro agriculture because we were fighting for people that had been practicing agriculture for a long time and whose livelihoods were being challenged and whose quality of life were really being challenged and whose water was being challenged by the presence of these big concentrated industrial style animal operations, especially hog operations. A lot of them were, tens of thousands of pigs that were in small buildings. And so that's how I got involved in this and started learning about agriculture and started working on it. And then I met my husband, Bill Nyman, through that work because we were working with a lot of Nyman Ranch farmers. And then I ended up marrying Bill and moving to California and started living on our ranch. So that's the kind of the most recent part of my life. And then I should just quickly say before that, I had grown up in Michigan and had been a lawyer, a prosecuting attorney, private practice attorney for a little while, and then I started working for these environmental groups. And and I grew up. My parents were both educators, and I had three siblings, fairly large family, and none of us, we weren't raised on a farm, and none of us expected to go into agriculture. But when I got the opportunity to, I was excited about it because I was always interested in it. And and then kind of jumping back forward again, being a little out of order here. Um, when Bill and I got married, I moved to California and I had already taken the bar exam. So I thought I would probably start practicing law, but I started working on the ranch instead. And I never ended up applying for any legal positions because I just kind of fell in love with the ranch and what we were doing here. And we didn't have any children at that point in time. And so for about 7 years, that was what I did pretty much full time, in addition to the fact that I started writing about agriculture and issues related to food and agriculture and sustainability. And I wrote 3 books. And then I started having children and I had 2 sons. And so then a lot of my last 17 years, my older son was born 17 years ago, has been spent taking care of my kids, helping out on the ranch a little bit, not nearly as much as I did before they were born, but still helping out on the ranch, and then continuing to do speaking and writing about agriculture and food and sustainability, and then doing other things like little league coaching and soccer coaching and helping out at the church and that kind of stuff. And then I've been on the school board for the last 5 years. So that kind of brings you up pretty close to speed of my background.
So first, the 3 books you wrote, what are the titles of those?
Okay, the first book I wrote was called Righteous Pork Chop: Finding a Life and Good Food Beyond Factory Farms. And that was really the book that I wrote that kind of described, it was a little bit of a memoir, and it was a lot about farming and agriculture and food. And it was describing what I had learned and seen and what I had done when I got hired by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to work for Waterkeeper Alliance, and the work that we were doing. Because when I first got hired by him, I didn't have any background in agriculture as far as being a lawyer. But he said to me pretty quickly on, he said, "We are hearing from people in many parts of the country that the biggest water quality problem they're having is from these big concentrated animal operations. And I want you to go and meet with people in these communities that are being affected by these. And I think we should be doing something about this." This is what he said to me. And so I went to Missouri, and that's where I first met with farmer. There were pretty much all farmers, in fact, the people that took me around in a community there in Missouri. And Terry Spence and Scott Dye were some of the folks involved in that. Some of your listeners might know those people, and they were both multi-generational farmers. And they were showing me how their community had been really negatively affected by premium standard farms, which had come in to their community. And then a little bit later, about a week or so later, I went to North Carolina and visited with Rick Dove, who unfortunately has passed away recently, but he was a remarkable advocate for people and for the environment and for rural people especially. And but anyway, he showed me what was happening down there where he lived in North Carolina and eastern North Carolina. And there were a lot of these very large, again, large scale concentrated hog operations. And there was a lot of pollution going into the waters, and it was affecting people's ability to swim and to fish. A lot of the people involved in this also were fishermen. And it was actually causing sores on the fish. And there was a lot of evidence showing that the pollution that was causing this was coming directly from these large concentrated hog operations that had come into the communities kind of from the outside and set up shop because the land was cheap and there was really no government will to stop them from doing this. So I got involved as the lawyer for Waterkeeper in trying to help the people in these communities to fight against these large polluting operations that were coming in and causing problems to their water and their quality of life.
And that's what created Righteous Pork Chop.
Yeah, so Righteous Pork Chop is the first book, and it's kind of telling that story. And then, that was my first book. And then what started happening, I was talking a lot, speaking a lot, being interviewed a lot about that book and traveling around to many parts of the country. And one thing that happened is people said to me quite often, actually, "Oh, I read your book and I became a vegetarian." And I thought that was not the message of this book at all. So I started thinking I need to make sure that I'm, clear, that I'm, clearer maybe, that I'm very supportive of well managed agriculture and especially animal agriculture. And in particular, because I was living on a beef cattle ranch and because I had worked as an environmental lawyer, I'd come across a lot of criticism of beef as a food and cattle in terms of the environmental impact. But at the same time, I was seeing on our own ranch and many other ranches that I was visiting that well-managed ranches were some of the most ecologically vibrant places I had ever seen. And they were producing really healthy, beautiful food that was really nourishing for people. And so I started thinking somebody's got to defend, this negative perception that's growing, and it's been out there for a while, and it keeps growing, about beef and cattle. And so I started thinking of it almost as I was a lawyer and I had defended, things in court before. And I started thinking someone needs to be, beef needs a good lawyer is the way I started thinking of it. And so I started thinking of creating a defense of beef and cattle. But I wasn't just going to write it dry like a legal brief. I wanted to tell it again as a story. And so the next book I wrote was called Defending Beef. And that one was talking about both the health issues and the nutrition issues, and then also the ecological issues, and basically making the case that well-managed cattle are very ecologically beneficial, provide all kinds of ecological services, and that the food that's produced from well-managed grazing cattle is extremely nutritious and very, very valuable to human health and not harmful to human health. And so the book is kind of divided into two major parts, the ecological side and the human health side. And then after I wrote that book, there was a lot of interest in it. And it had been out there for several years. I had done a lot of speaking about it. And there was still more and more interest in the topic. And so my publisher asked me to rewrite it and do a new version of it. And I did that. So the third book I wrote was also called Defending Beef, but we changed the subtitle and it's now Defending Beef, the Ecological and Nutritional Case for Meat. And that is my last book that I've written. And it's basically very similar to the second book, but with a lot of additional information and updated studies and more analysis about sort of the importance of cattle and beef. And it also explains why I returned to meat eating, because I had been a vegetarian. And by the time I wrote the third book, I had returned to eating meat. So there's a whole big discussion in that one too about why I came back to being a meat eater.
Okay, so now I think I've read the first version. So now I need to read the second version then.
Yeah, I always tell people, like, if you've read the first version, it's not mandatory reading to do the second one, but it is really updated, and there's a lot of additional stuff in there. And I prefer the second version because I got a lot more time to think about it in between. And I still love that first book, but the second one is the one that I had basically, 5 years to think about it and to work on it. And so that's the one I think really does the best job of putting this all in one place and explaining, there's so much skepticism out there still today about should we even be eating beef, and should we even have cattle? And the more I've learned, the more I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. We need them. We need the animals and we need their food that they produce. And so I just continuously feel compelled to talk about it and explain to people why I believe this so strongly.
Yes. Which then leads to, well, I'm leading somewhere, but the second question then is Niman Ranch. What is your guys' setup there? Is it a yearling operation? Is it cow calf? What's that look like?
Well, so our ranch, Bill started it, and he started the Niman Ranch Company here. He started our ranch. He started selling just really locally, and then he eventually, not that long into it, just a few years into it, he was getting more demand for his product than he could supply, and he started networking with other people that were doing things the same way he was doing them in order to be able to supply the customers. And, like I mentioned, our ranch is near San Francisco. So he had some really well-known restaurants like Zuni Cafe and Chez Panisse. Right at the very beginning of his efforts to sell meat, he had some of the most famous restaurants in the world actually as customers. And that helped him to grow the brand pretty quickly. And actually, it was originally called Niman Shell because Orville Shell, who's a journalist and an author and has done a lot of interesting work. He's an expert on China and very interesting man. But he was the original co-founder with Bill. So it was originally called Niman Shell. But then he left the company just a few years after they started doing it. And then Bill continued on, and then it became known as Niman Ranch. And then Bill, just grew it basically one employee and one, ranch at a time. And he left the company, actually. We're still on this original ranch, but the company that he built up, we're not associated with it anymore. He left that about 17, 18 years ago. And at the time he left, they had a couple hundred employees and they had about 750 farms and ranches that were in the network. So he he built it up into quite a significant enterprise. And the whole point of it always was to be able to connect the farmers and ranchers who were doing things really well and to a really high standard with the consumer that wanted a really quality product and really cared about having something that was very nutritious and was really well raised. And a lot of those were restaurants, and some of those were special kinds of retail places like Marzik's Fine Food in Denver, that kind of place, or Buy Right Market in San Francisco. Those were the kinds of retail shops that were carrying it. And then eventually, as it got bigger, there was actually Niman Ranch meat in Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and places like that. But it started out being mostly in restaurants and some very special kinds of retail shops where they had, really high quality food. But we left that company, like I said, a number of years ago, and then he and I created something called BN Ranch, which was the next company that we created. And by that time, we were just doing grass-fed cattle, and and then we also were doing heritage turkeys. So we had heritage turkeys and totally grass-fed beef. And that's similar to what we still do today. Not exactly the same. We're still doing totally grass-fed beef. Our cattle are we have mother cows, we have calves, we have yearlings. For a couple of years, we were working with a neighbor of ours, and he was taking sort of mature yearlings from us and raising them all the way to slaughter. His name is Lauren Poncia, and it's Dimple Creek is the company. And so our cattle were going there as kind of mature calves, or yearlings really. And they would go there for the second year of their lives, basically. And then they were going to slaughter, and they were going under the Stumble Creek label. We were doing that for a while. We're not working with them right now, but so we're back to selling. Basically, we sell directly to some consumers, some retail stores, and some restaurants. And so we're kind of back where we started in a way. We kind of went a full long, arc, and we're back down to a very small number. I mean, that's actually the same number of animals here on the ranch as we have pretty much the whole time I've been here. But we're not a network of ranches right now. We're just us. And then Bill has very diligently been working for about the last 6 or 7 years to create a chicken that is slower growing than a modern bird, but is not as fast growing, or is not as slow as a heritage, and not nearly as fast growing as a modern bird. So it's kind of in between, and it's meant to be an animal that's very healthy, living outdoors, and with very little, without any drugs in the ration or anything like that, and with a high premium on the eating quality and the healthfulness of the animal. So it's kind of similar to what we try to do with, all the food that we produce.
And so that, I mean, we've really laid a foundation.
Yes.
But I do want to make sure we capture what your political platform is, what you're running on, and then why you're running. We touched on it yesterday, and I want you to touch on it again.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. And I realize I'm just giving you these incredibly long answers, so I'll try to be a little briefer. The reason I'm running is because I learned about, well, okay, I'm going to take one step back.
Yeah.
For the last 25 years, starting when I was working at Waterkeeper Alliance, I've done a lot of work in rural communities and with farmers and ranchers. And I've done it both, as an author and as someone helping Bill with the Niman Ranch Company, which I did for a number of years when he was still there. And then we co-created this BN Ranch Company, and I worked a lot on that. And then I do a lot of speaking about my books, and I'm often doing those in rural communities and meeting with farmers and ranchers. And so I've spent a lot of time in rural communities and with rural people and discussing rural issues, not just agriculture, but a lot of it is about agriculture. And I just, more and more over the last couple decades, I started to realize that there was an incredible disconnect between the things that were affecting people in rural communities and the things they were concerned about, and what was understood in urban areas. And this has been really important in terms of, for example, how environmental groups are prioritizing issues. So, for example, when I met Scott Dye in Missouri, when I started working when I was working for Waterkeeper Alliance, and I met with Scott Dye, he was actually working for the Sierra Club. And Sierra Club was trying at that time, so this is like, 25, 30 years ago, they were trying to make sure that they were advocating for what they thought were environmentally sound farming practices. Okay. And so they had Scott Dye, who'd grown up on a multi-generational farm and who was advocating for farming communities and for farmers. Well, that shifted quite a bit in the following years to where Sierra Club was not really doing much, if anything, to support farming or ranching at all. And all of their work was more in the direction of criticizing or suing or attacking farming and ranching and the people doing it. And in particular, people raising animals for food and cattle. And I've seen this happen, over the last couple decades, and I have witnessed it again and again when I'm talking with people that live in urban areas and consider themselves to be environmentalists, that they don't have a real understanding of rural communities or issues. And in many cases, they have a very oversimplified view and they think of, oh, farming is bad, especially beef is really bad for the environment, cattle are bad for the environment. And there wasn't much subtlety there. There wasn't much nuanced understanding about it at all. And actually, I started using this phrase with the Defending Beef books. It's not the cow, it's the how. And I started trying to use that all the time to get people to think about, it's not to be against or for agriculture because we need food, right? We have to have food, and we need people raising the food, and we need them to be able to make a living, and to be able to live in rural communities. These are not, jobs that you live in the city and you drive out for, and drive back at night. And so I just started realizing there was a big disconnect between kind of the halls of power, so to speak, like in the state capitals and in Washington D.C., and rural communities and rural issues. And then I was really seeing that here in California where I live, and it kind of came right home to us because in the Point Reyes National Seashore where we live, we were a couple years ago, we were one of 14 families that was in the Point Reyes National Seashore, which is under the direction of the National Park Service, even though it's not actually the same thing as a national park. It's a little different. Because it was created in 1962 when there were a lot of farms and ranches here already. And there was the idea when it was created that they would be preserved and that those uses would continue. But over the last couple decades, as this shift was happening, where you had less and less understanding and appreciation for agriculture among environmental groups and urban people where those environmental groups are creating their agendas, there was less and less support for the idea that you should have the ranchers here. And a couple of years ago, there had been a lot of litigation about the ranches in this national seashore here, and there began to be a closed door settlement process. And last January, there was an announcement that of the 14 families that were in the Point Reyes National Seashore, all of whom were multi-generational families, except for ours. We're actually a first-generation ranch here, but all the others were multi-generational ranches, that 12 of those families and ranches would be leaving. They would be shutting down and departing. And this was a very, very shocking announcement for the community because these were ranches that had been established 7 generations ago in some cases, or 5 generations ago, with the same stable families doing the work and living there and being part of the communities. So they were really the bedrock of the Point Reyes community. And I found out about this. My husband and I found out about this at the same time that everybody in the public did, which was, it was kind of shocking when we heard about it. But we also kind of figured, well, there's nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. And then we realized that that might not be the case. And after we had some conversations with some attorneys, we ended up making the decision to sue the federal government over what they had done there, and with the hope that we could prevent any of the families who wanted to stay from leaving if they wanted to stay, and then also to be able to keep all the land in agriculture. Because one of the things that the Park Service said it was going to do, it was going to take all the agricultural land and essentially rezone it and turn it into wildlife or natural. I can't remember the exact term they used, but essentially, unmanaged, non-agricultural uses, natural. And we realized right away that that was going to have a dramatic impact on this community and the food system around here, as well as all the people and the employment and the schools. And there's so many things that affects when you do something like that. So we're still doing that lawsuit, a year later. Litigation takes a lot of time,
Yes.
but we feel like we're making some progress. And in the process of spending time learning about how all this happened, I discovered that our congressman here, who's named Jared Huffman, that he was involved in the getting the ranchers to leave, deeply involved. And so much so, in fact, that I think he was putting inappropriate pressure on a lot of the people. And it would never have happened without his involvement. And that's when I started realizing that not only was he doing something that was wrong in this case, but that he didn't understand agriculture and didn't care about it and didn't value it. And I started talking to more people throughout the state, and I found out that that was a very widely held view of him. And I started thinking someone's got to run against him, but it wasn't really possible to do that because he's a Democrat and he's an incumbent, and this district was drawn in such a way that he had a plus 40 rated Dem seat, so he was expected to win by 40 points based on the population that's here. And then because of Proposition 50, which redistricted the state, it took away a bunch of Republican seats, which was caused a lot of people to be very angry. But it did also weaken the strength of the incumbents hold on this district. And that is when I decided to run myself, because I realized that he doesn't have the interest or the knowledge or even the concern about rural communities. And this district had already been pretty rural, but it became way more rural with the redistricting. 3 new counties were added that have a lot of that are primarily rural areas. So I thought someone who really cares about agriculture, someone who understands rural issues and who cares about them, needs to be the congressperson for this district. And that's why I ran.
So not just the rural, but being that you lived in New York City, and then you had mentioned that you're also within your community, you're in a little bit more of a populated area. So
That's
you'd
right.
be pretty well rounded then.
Yes, I have. I actually have lived in San Francisco. I have lived in Washington, D.C. I lived 2 years abroad, both times that I did that, 1 year in France, 1 year in Senegal, West Africa. I was living in big cities both of those times, and I've lived in New York City for almost 5 years. So I do have a strong urban background. I grew up in a suburban part of southwestern Michigan, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I served on the city council for 4 years when I was in my 20s and early 30s. And during those times, I was primarily working on and thinking about urban and suburban issues. So I have, a pretty strong background in that too. And the place where I live right now, Bolinas, is a small town, but we are literally within sight of San Francisco. We can see San Francisco from our ranch. So we're in a place that we're near urban areas, and this county that we live in, Marin County, it has the greatest population base for the whole district. So what's happened is you have this unique situation where you have a district that is mostly rural and very large. It's the largest one in California and one of the largest ones in the country now. And but the population base of it is mostly in down by this Marin County, which is close to San Francisco and Oakland and everything. And so it's just a very diverse district. You have really urban perspectives and really rural perspectives, really liberal, really conservative, and it's all in one giant district, all rolled up into one ball. So somebody has to be able to try to represent all of that. And that's the challenge of this district. And in addition to the fact that I have this, kind of unusual background where I've had both urban and rural experiences, I also have never joined a political party. So even though I was involved in politics my whole life, I started volunteering on campaigns when I was in high school. I spent 2 semesters in college working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And I've voted in every single election since I turned 18, and I've, was a city council member, as I said, for 2 terms, and I've been on the school board for 5 years. I'm in my second term on the school board. So I've done a lot of work in elected offices and for people that are running for elected offices, but I never joined a political party because I'm just one of these kind of people who likes to make up my own mind and not be told by some large group what I think or who I don't like or who I do like, and I think it's like there's so much to me that's wrong with the way politics are practiced in this country today. And the biggest problem is the tribalism. You have very extreme views on each end. And then most people actually are much more toward the center, but the conversation kind of gets driven by the 2 polar ends of it. And what I've found is that by not being a member of a political party, I've always been able to move well among all those groups. And like on the school board and on the city council, when I was on there, I was a nonpartisan and I could talk to everyone, and I had no one viewed me as their enemy or someone they didn't want to talk to. And I was able to help, you know, come up with ideas and solve problems and build consensus on things because that's how you solve problems. You know, that's how you move things forward. And right now in Washington, we don't have that happening at all. It's really, there's like a stalemate. It's dysfunctional. It's, you know, there's literally nothing happening. As Ben Sass said, you know, Senator Ben Sass said on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about he left the US Senate because there was nothing getting done. And that is true for the US House as well. So if I were elected, I would be the first independent in the country to be in the US House. So it's not the usual thing, but I think it's really, really needed right now.
Oh, I absolutely can agree with that. And I think you're absolutely right that most people actually are in the middle
Yes, totally.
and a lot of issues. So
Exactly. And you know, the thing is, most people are also not like super, you know, ideological or dogmatic. So one thing I found when I've been out campaigning, it's been so interesting, fascinating actually. Um, I'm talking to people in very rural areas in some cases and in, you know, bigger cities in some cases. And again, it doesn't really matter who I'm talking to or what group I'm talking with. What I'm hearing about are issues that are directly affecting people's lives. And so they're talking to me about things like whether or not they have good access to healthcare, the cost of gas and diesel, how difficult it is to get affordable housing here, especially in California here. And these are the kinds of things people are talking to me about. And also in the case of the farmers and ranchers, I'm hearing a lot about some of the challenges, you know, uniquely for that industry in terms of, you know, lack of you know, slaughter and processing facilities, for example, in some areas and things like that. And so these are very practical issues that people are talking about. And, you know, I said to someone last night, I said, I have not had one single person, not one, bring up transgender youth sports. I mean, not one person has brought that up. Okay. And yet, if you would look at the news or social media, you would think that's like the hottest topic out there in the country today. You know
Yep.
what I mean? So this is what I keep being struck by is like there are these hot button issues that are very divisive and people fall in really different, you know, camps on them. But the bread and butter issues are the things that are about people's livelihood, their ability to practice their job, their ability to have shelter, their ability to pay for their healthcare and have access to healthcare. Things like that are the things that are really on people's minds. And I believe that is the work of the congressperson, you know, and not just like in Washington, D.C., but very specifically in those communities. I think that the approach that a member of Congress should be making, or a U.S. Senator, same thing, is to really understand what's happening in their district and to help come up with solutions and remove obstacles, more importantly, even to solutions in all the communities in their districts. And that's a much more kind of that's a less sexy in a way, you know, less kind of glamorous kind of thing to be working on maybe, but that's the work. And you know, the way I see it, I'm a really hard worker and I'm not someone who's like trying to, you know, catch a bunch of glory. I'm very pragmatic. I like to solve problems and help people solve their problems and help them figure out, you know, how do we do this kind of a thing. And so I think I'm actually well suited for that kind of work. And I think we really need that approach now at this time.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would be amiss if I did not ask you, for anybody that is listening, whether it be out of your district or anybody within AGA or um, exactly how would you define your platform? It means of what are those issues at the top of your list that you're wanting to make a difference in? She brought up, you know, the livelihood of the cost of things and then a housing issue. I mean, what would you classify as your top 5 issues that's important?
Yeah. Well, I would just say I do not feel like I'm running as a traditional politician would on a platform.
Yeah.
Um, as I was just describing, I really think of myself as someone running to try to change the way politics are being carried out in this country and specifically in this district, coming at it from a really different approach. And so that's probably the first question a lot of people ask me. It's the most common one I get is, "What's your platform?" And I'm like, and I don't necessarily aren't super comfortable when I say, "Well, I'm not really running on a platform,"
Yeah.
but that's the truth. And the truth of the matter is, I'm really trying to run on this idea that we need to do this office, this elected office, in a different way. And it needs to be about helping communities and helping the people in those communities succeed at whatever their community is doing, whether it's, a community that has, um, for example, right here in our community, we have a pretty robust community of fishermen. And there's a active effort to take away the limited access that they still have. There's been a lot of loss of access to this fishery here, and now there's an effort to take away that final bit. And so for me, in Bolinas, one of the really important things right now is help protect the access that those fisher people have, to the just be able to feed themselves and their families and be able to practice their profession.
Yeah.
I was in Eureka a couple days ago up in Humboldt County, and up there are a lot of people involved in the timber industry. And so in their community, they're really concerned about, what's happening in the timber industry and the cost of diesel fuel and the fact that it's almost impossible to in an economical way deal with the trees that they need to remove just to manage the forest. So one of the things that's been happening up there is a lot of the timber companies are cutting down trees and piling them into piles and burning them as waste. I mean, it's crazy. It causes pollution. It doesn't, harvest the energy or the lumber of those trees, but the cost of hauling them away is so expensive, and there's no sort of economical way to do biofuel out of those trees because that industry hasn't been supported in this state. So I would look at with their community and say, okay, is there something that could be done to try to help have more sensible, policies with respect to forestry? And so just kind of wherever you go, there are going to be different issues. And throughout the whole district, especially in rural areas, I've been hearing about the lack of affordable healthcare or just any healthcare at all. Um, a lot of rural hospitals have been, their funding has been dramatically cut. A lot of rural hospitals in California, they are having to do seismic upgrades, and they're extremely expensive, and they're not funded by the state, but they're mandated by the state. So this is kind of that unfunded mandate thing. And so, just helping to figure out like, okay, what could be done to help these hospitals be able to continue to keep their doors open. So these are very community specific concerns, even though there's a lot of they're widespread throughout this very large district. And so I see myself as someone who wants to try to represent the entire district and to try to help every community to thrive, to be able to have people be able to live there, work there, and afford to have healthcare and food and fuel and housing. And that doesn't really sound like a platform, maybe, but that's as close as I can get.
Yeah. I absolutely love your answer. I think it's beautiful. And that's because your boots on the ground and you're actually talking to people rather than,
Yes.
within our state, it's a lot of times they spend most of their time in DC. So they really lose touch with what's actually going on. And they're not making trips to, especially rural areas, to talk to those voters.
Oh, I heard several times, Sadie. I've been told several times as I've been up in these rural communities, like, oh, this is the first time we've had someone, even a candidate for this office, come to this community in 10 or more years. So it
Crazy.
is, in fact, the norm, the fact that, the rural communities are not being fully represented. And the one thing I've heard in all of those areas is we don't feel like we have a voice in what's happening in our state capital, Sacramento for us, and or Washington. And so there's a lot of you know, I would say there's suspicion towards things that are coming from the state, and coming from the federal government, and they're being regulated. They're being told they have to do a lot of stuff, but there isn't a lot of help for their communities. And so that to me is the challenge. How do we make sure that what we're doing um, when we're enacting laws and we're making budgetary priorities and so forth, how do we make sure that we're making sure that we have vibrant rural communities? Because I really believe in the importance of those communities and those people and the professions that they're practicing. And one thing I've realized is a lot of the policy right now, national and statewide policy in California, is assuming that the rural people aren't that important. And in fact, that there are going to be fewer and fewer of them. So we have to focus everything on urban areas and urban people. And I just don't see it that way at all. And I also don't think that that makes for a healthy democracy or for, engaged citizens. which is what we should all be trying to do, because this country is never going to be working again, and it's never going to be um, a place that's fulfilling its promise as a democracy unless we are actually engaging all of our citizens and not just writing off huge swaths of them.
Right. Right. And especially as you've stated, and just the importance of, you lose agriculture. It's been said many times, if you lose ag, the country soon falls after. So we do need people that are feeding the country. But
Yeah, and there's that connection to the land too. It's a little bit less tangible. Um, but I've talked about it quite a bit in my books, that I've seen this over and over again, that there's this land ethic that you get when you live out on the land, and you're out there every day observing what's happening with the birds and the plants and the soils and the wind and the rainfall. And every time when my husband and I travel together and we go onto a farm or ranch, the very first thing that we immediately start talking about is what the weather's been like for the last couple weeks, and then, we'll always talk about, the soil and the animals and the wildlife, the waters, the rivers. I mean, it's just always part of the conversation, and it's part of the knowledge base that the people have. And so I've always thought of people in agriculture as the most important stewards of our land and our waters. And if we understand it that way, then I think we approach the whole population of people in rural areas in a different way, and I think we value them more, and we should.
I really like everything that you've had to say. And it's not that I wish I lived in California, but I wish you were on the ticket in
No,
my
you're good. You're good. I like to speak about positive things, and I don't like to dwell on the negative. But I do feel like this state right now has gotten, we are, everybody in agriculture and elsewhere is just, we've kind of gotten to the maximum burden as far as regulations. Like, I do not think this state can continue going in that direction. And so I kind of envy Nebraskans because you guys have got a lot more freedoms and ability to get things done than we do. But we can all
Yeah.
learn from each other, right?
That's right. Well, and I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time, because I really do enjoy talking with you. I could really take up a lot of your time, but I want to make sure. I know you're a busy woman, and I appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else that I did not push you on that you want to make sure to share?
No, I guess I would just say, one thing that I was really proud of, when I wrote the books and the talks that I've given over the years, which I've given a lot of talks in rural areas about my books and about the ideas I've been writing about. One thing that kept happening to me was people would say, "Oh, I feel so much better after I'm listening to you." And I just want to say, as I do say in my books over and over again, how um, how much pride I have in just the fact that I get to be part of a ranching family and a ranching community, and how impressed I am almost every single time I go and visit with in fact, I just this last visit I just did up in Del Norte County. I was staying with the Alexander family, and they have this beautiful dairy farm and creamery that they're actually producing all kinds of wonderful food products, cream and cottage cheese, sour cream, kefir, yogurt. They do it all. And every time I'm around people like that, and Blake and Stephanie Alexander are the patriarch and matriarch of the family, but their grown children are working there, and it just gives me so much appreciation for the people practicing agriculture and the wonderful food that they're producing, and it just makes me really happy that I'm part of the effort to try to help make their work easier and to defend their importance of their work. And I just kind of want to say how important I think it is that everyone values the work of farmers and ranchers, and I just hope that everyone gets to feel that pride, because it's a hard thing to make a living in, and sometimes we get depressed about the obstacles and the challenges. And I just want to say, I think it's something we can all be really proud of to be involved in, and all of us can do better than we're doing. There's always work to do to help, to make our ecological knowledge higher, and there's always work to do, and none of us are perfect. But we're all doing something really important and valuable. And I think the children who grow up on farms and ranches have the best foundation for a happy life because they're connected to their families, they're connected to the animals, the plants, the land, and they get to have a level of freedom and responsibility and self-determination that very few children get to do today. So I just want to kind of throw a shout out there to all the people listening that are doing the farming, doing the hard work, and producing the food because you matter so much.
Thank you. That's rarely do you get to hear what anyone in politics necessarily give a shout out to that because it's such a small percentage of the population that's doing it. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely the way I feel. So I'm glad I got a chance to say it.
Yes. Well, thank you again so much for your time. And this is perfect timing. And everybody take your free right to go and vote, and it's very, very important.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yes, ma'am. Well, we'll be talking soon, and I'll be watching the results.
Okay. June 2nd is the primary.
Perfect.
So we'll see. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.